And I think if we get that, this is sort of how I think Ethereum ends up being like tolerated in the world. I think there's a lot of the like core ethos around blockchains that's just fundamentally at odds with like, how corporations, how nation states view themselves. Just the idea that you like have money that's not tied to any like central issuing entity that people can send freely all over the world is like a pretty contentious thing. And so I think if we want that part of blockchains, where like if we believe that having, economies that are kind of untethered from geographical and nation state boundaries, that's great and we should do it, but we should also think about like what do we offer back to the world such that they tolerate this and they don't just see it as like purely negative sum for them.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Tim Beiko, part of the protocol team at the Ethereum Foundation. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting builders and founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Tim at the Ethereum Foundation. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm here today with Tim Beiko, part of the protocol team at the Ethereum Foundation. Tim, what's up? How are you doing today?
Hi, Tanner. Thanks for having me. I'm doing good.
Good. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk today. This is going to be really an awesome chat. I think before we get started with some of the bigger conversation, I'd love to just get a sense for your story before we really dive in. And I was thinking maybe one way of getting at that is to talk a little bit about your work before the Ethereum Foundation. So you were at Element AI and then kind of made your way to Consensus and ultimately the Ethereum Foundation. I think my question was going to be, what did your thinking at each point look like? How did you end up gravitating to the opportunities that brought you to the work you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely a good place to start. So I've been following crypto for a while. So I think I first heard about Bitcoin in 2013, 2014. I heard about Ethereum when the DAO happened, but when the DAO was the project and not the hack. So I was like in school at the time. I sort of knew about Bitcoin and then had heard about Ethereum, but the DAO was really like the first big application on Ethereum. For people who aren't familiar, it was like effectively like a VC fund that was organized as a DAO. So if you bought tokens, in the DAO, you could like have a vote in like which companies the fund invests in. And so that's kind of what got me interested. So I bought some Ether and then I bought some DAO tokens. And then about a week or two after I did that, the DAO got hacked on Ethereum. So this was the largest hack at the time. I think it had raised something like 15% of all ETH that was circulating, and somebody just managed to hack the whole thing. And so that was really kind of a forced dive down the rabbit hole of like, okay, I have these tokens and this thing that got hacked, what happens with that? And then after the DAO hack, there was like this whole resolution with a hard fork, and then that led to the creation of Ethereum Classic. So then you had, all your coins being split on two chains. So that was like kind of a forcing function to like actually get a bit deeper than I probably otherwise would have.
Right.
And then after the hack, for about 6 months or maybe a bit more, I wasn't sure Ethereum was actually that good of an idea because you had a smart contract platform, but then if you couldn't write safe smart contracts, was there actually a ton of value in having that? So I kept following I kept following what was happening, but like not as closely for a while. And in the time I was interested in AI. So I just, was like studying and ended up working in that as well. But I'd say late 2016, early 2017, you start to see a bunch of new projects also launch on Ethereum. This was like the first wave of ICOs. And by mid 2017, there was this huge ICO boom. And I think at that point, it became pretty clear to me that like, there would be demand for like Ethereum, even if every project like so far like failed, got hacked, was a scam, whatever. Clearly there was like demand to use the protocol itself. And that got me really interested in wanting to work on the protocol directly. So I think I wasn't confident enough to, go work on any of the applications being built on Ethereum, but I definitely want to get involved more in the protocol just because as a user, you could tell that like things were a bit fragile and like clunky and whatnot. And like, if we could improve this, then, we could probably unlock way more demand. But at the time, I was a product manager with a background in AI. And so not only didn't have any like experience working on blockchain stuff, I also wasn't like a researcher or like a software engineer. So it took some time to find a job that like worked with my background, with the stuff I wanted to work on. And I got kind of lucky in a sense where in 2018, Consensus started to put together a protocol team, and they were basically the first ones to hire product managers for that. So historically, before that, I think most protocol teams were just like a bunch of researchers or a bunch of engineers. They didn't have like the structure of like a traditional, I don't know, tech startup like team company or team structure. But yeah, Consensus went that route. So they hired me as a product manager. And then that's how I got to like start working full time on Ethereum. I was working on their Ethereum client Beiko there. So I did that for 2.5 years, got to understand how, the protocol works, how like the software that runs the protocol works, and the way that changes to the protocol are made in Ethereum. There are these public calls where all the different companies and entities working on Ethereum get together and chat about potential changes. Those are called all core devs. So there was somebody running them for probably 5 years when I joined Consensus, called Hudson. And in about 2020 or so, he decided he wanted to step down. And so asked me if I'd want to take over for him running the calls. So instead of being on one of the implementations of the protocols, I'd sort of help, coordinate all these different teams and get them to agree on how we, what changes we make to Ethereum and how we make those changes. And so that's when I joined the EF. So I joined the EF in late 2020, early 2021. And that's basically what I've been doing since. So now I help coordinate all these different teams working on Ethereum and just think a bit more broadly about like, what does it take to get a good ecosystem of contributors to the protocol.
Love it. Okay, fascinating journey. There's elements of that I want to call out at different points in this conversation to kind of revisit. But, one of those things that I think maybe you may be best known for, or well known for, is the merge and your role in the merge. And we're coming up here on the kind of 1-year anniversary. And so I wanted to maybe do a little bit of a retrospective question here, which is, the merge was really like the Super Bowl for crypto, right? This transition from from POW to POS. So like, everyone's tuned in to watch how it went. It's all everyone talked about for a while. And as one of the lead engineers for the merge, kind of coordinating a lot of that activity, how do you reflect on that experience here almost a year after it was executed?
Yeah, probably the weirdest thing is that when we do changes to Ethereum, we really have to get them right. Like, we can't break the chain, but then they sort of work forever, right? And we very quickly go from this mode where like, before the merge goes live, it's like thinking about every single potential edge case and, loads and loads of testing and will this thing ever work and are we confident in it? But then it's like, as soon as it's happened and it works, we kind of take it for granted in a way because it just runs on the network by itself. And now, for example, we're working on like, it's been already another upgrade since the merge and we're working on the one after that. And so every time we stand up a new testnet, a new devnet or whatever, like we assume the merge has happened, we run the transition on it if we have to or something like that. But it's like, now it's just like almost a dependency of the stack. It's pretty crazy that like you spend all this upfront time, building this thing and making sure it really works, but then it sort of chugs along kind of forever and doesn't really need any updates. And that's very different than like a lot of consumer tech or like, web software that gets built. So it's almost a bit closer to like building like a physical thing, like a car or a plane, right? Where like, you might spend a ton of time designing this engine or designing, the entire plane or whatever. But then like the plane just like flies all the time and it's fine. So yeah, I'd say that's probably like the biggest thing where the contrast between spending so much time and effort and like mental cycles thinking about all the possible edge cases and how is this thing going to work and is it even going to work, to then a year later, we basically fully take it for granted and, it just like works in the background and no one's even thinking about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's almost all too human, right? Where all of this work happens and then life continues, right?
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious, just kind of looking, that's a great look back. I'm curious a little bit of a look forward where, again, the merge was just such a topic of conversation. It was so important for the space. And there's been significant work, from your teams even since then, right? So I don't want to minimize any of that by kind of fixating on the merge by any means. But, what are you thinking about these days that might capture everyone's attention to the extent that the merge did?
Yeah, so I don't know if we'll be able to top that because we sort of advertised the merge for like 6 years or something, and then it eventually happened.
Yeah.
But I think, look, right now the thing the merge gave us is it gave us definitely like better security of the network in that we can now punish validators rather than just have incentives for miners. It didn't quite help for scalability directly, but it gave us like the scaffolding or the infrastructure that we then need to build better scalability solutions. And I think that's really like where a lot of our attention has shifted now. So you've obviously probably heard about layer twos and all of that. And that's really the strategy that Ethereum is thinking about with regards to scaling. So you just can't have like a single chain that processes all the transactions for everyone in the world if you want the nodes on that chain to be able to be run with like relatively cheap hardware and bandwidth access, right? Like, I have a MacBook in front of me and, I'm in my apartment. Like if I want to run my Ethereum node on my MacBook and with like my residential internet connection, there's no way I could process, millions or even hundreds of thousands of transactions every second. What Ethereum's plan is around that to still like offer scalability to users is we have this idea of layer twos, which are basically separate blockchains that run all their transactions, outside of the main chain, but then they post the data back for those transactions on Ethereum layer one without actually running the computation. So they just post back all the data and, they can do some fancy things around like compressing that data to get some more scalability gains. But because it's basically quite expensive to run computations on Ethereum, but cheaper to post data there, you can get like much more transactions in using these layer twos. And so the big thing we're focused on now in terms of the protocols is getting better sort of data storage infrastructure for these layer twos. And what this means in practice is that today, if you post data to the Ethereum network, it sort of gets stored forever on the network. So every node on chain stores a copy. And because of that, we need to price it quite high because you're like imposing this cost, on the network forever. But layer twos don't actually need the data to be stored forever. They only need it to be stored long enough that if there was an issue on the layer two, we could like go back to L1, figure out what happened and resolve it and, move on from there. And so if you're familiar with, say, like optimistic rollups, they assume already that like within 7 days, if you're like initiating your withdrawal from the L2, within 7 days, if something had gone wrong, somebody would have flagged it. And if not, then you're good to go. So you sort of go from a world where like Ethereum currently stores data forever to L2s needed it for about a week or so. And so this is the main thing we're working on now is introducing like temporary data storage on Ethereum. And this is what people call data availability. And so when you hear data availability, the idea is just that these networks can provide data storage that's still secure, but because it's not stored forever, you can charge much less for it. And then those cost savings get passed on to the users of layer twos. Because today, like about 95 to 99% of an L2 transaction is just posting the data back to L1. So the cheaper we can make that, then the more scalability and the lower the cost we can get for L2. So this might not be something that's like as flashy as the merge. And it's also not something that'll be such a like phase transition, like going from one thing to another. But it's a type of thing that can actually help Ethereum, onboard orders of magnitude more users.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I love it. So, you're in a unique position where I feel like I can ask this question confidently, where, you're entrusted with bringing to life this kind of ever unfolding vision of what Ethereum could and should be, right? It's not a short timeline. We're talking years and years of hard work to really progress each component of the vision. And so my question is, how do you think about patience with respect to bringing about a potential vision where, really kind of this balancing act between not losing morale because it's taking so long, but also not having too much enthusiasm maybe because still it's going to take a while to accomplish each part. How do you sort of manage that with your team and think about it yourself?
Yeah, this is like a really hard thing. I think there's some aspect where you have to be like almost overly optimistic and like, otherwise you just wouldn't do the thing. And this was true of the merge, but I think it's true of like everything. And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you think you can do the thing in a year, it'll probably take 2 years. But if you thought it would take 2 years, it might take 4 years.
Right.
So I don't know of like a great way to do this, except like I think I spend not necessarily a lot of time on this, but like I definitely spend some time like when new people come in and like say want to do a big change to Ethereum, trying to like get their expectations to somewhere that's reasonable. Probably moving their expectations from like being overly optimistic to maybe just optimistic so that they're not disappointed or like disheartened enough that they won't do the work. But they're also not expecting, to change all of Ethereum in like 6 months. Yeah, and I think so that's definitely one part of it. I think the other part that like we've gotten much better at in the past couple of years is building better testing infrastructure. So actually, yeah, that's probably one of the other parts. So like having better infrastructure and like being able to more confidently test stuff helps speed things along a little bit because like we can just like reduce uncertainty quicker. So that's been like a huge other thing where like even though there's like multi-year efforts, you break it up into smaller chunks and you can have like high confidence in each of those chunks moving forward and sort of, get momentum that way. But yeah, there's like no way around it, right? Like I think, again, if you take the example of like building physical things rather than building software, like if you're working on like a new airplane or like, a new iPhone model or whatever, like these things just take time. Yeah. And you sort of have to be okay with that at some level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what does it look like? You mentioned like in the scenario where someone comes in, wants to change Ethereum in some particular way. I was curious, like, what does it look like for an idea to become significant enough within the Ethereum Foundation to warrant further exploration or dedication of engineering time? Like the prioritization conversation, basically. What does that look like
Yeah,
from
yeah.
kind of your vantage point?
Of course. And maybe I'll start by saying like the Ethereum Foundation doesn't get like a veto right on like what gets worked on or what gets done in Ethereum, right? Like we build some common infrastructure. Like I help, coordinate the calls where people have these debates, but like I don't get to choose what goes in the upgrade, right? It's not like I'm the sort of, think of like a traditional tech company where like I don't know, the product lead and I'm like, okay, we're doing X, Y, and Z. It's like the best we can do is get all the people, around the table or like on a Zoom call and ask them what they think we should do and help like guide that conversation. And similarly, in terms of just the software, the best we can do is like we can write like some testing infrastructure. We can obviously do some research, but like we can't like necessarily make everybody go one way. So I think so what the process looks like is, there is like a formal process of like you can write the specification for your change, get it reviewed, and have the different implementation teams, give you feedback. And if they think it's valuable enough and good enough, then, eventually it might get deployed on mainnet. And I think how complex it is to like, get something prioritized or get something done depends on like how big of a change it is. Because as Ethereum grows and has more value, has more users depending on it, like it should be hard to change it, right? Like if you're using Ethereum and you have your life savings on it or you've built a business on it, then the platform shouldn't just like change in a completely random way under you tomorrow, right? So like if you have like a big change, then you should expect to spend years like literally, not only working on the technical parts of it, but trying to understand the impact that it has on people and like, ideally mitigating that impact. And if you absolutely can't mitigate the impact, you're going to need a pretty strong case for why, your thing is so beneficial that it's worth, impacting others. Yeah. And that process is sort of like more social / political process. Like there's no one way to do it, I think, but you can think of it as like going to all the relevant stakeholders, trying to get them on board and being able to articulate, that this has happened and, get like buy-in from those people. And maybe one example of like a medium-sized change recently that was done this way is there's like a new EVM opcode. So EVM is the computer, the virtual machine that runs on Ethereum. There's a new operation that's being added in the next few months. And this is something that was proposed years ago. And probably a year or two ago, someone from Uniswap thought that, this old idea could actually be quite beneficial to them. And so Uniswap spent a bunch of time in, 2021, 2022, trying to get this change in. And not only like it was obviously beneficial for them, but like they had to go and sort of, figure out, is it beneficial for like all the other applications on Ethereum? Are there applications that are harmed by this? Is this something that like the languages like Solidity and Viper can support? Is this something that's safe and whatnot? So they went through this entire process, and now it's like scheduled to go live in the next couple of months. But I think it's a good example of like a team that came in, took something that was already proposed that they saw value in, and built like support for it and like addressed a lot of the concerns around it. And that's took on the order of like 1 or 2 years. So just to put it in perspective, for anyone listening who might want to try this, it's not something that's impossible, but it's something like you need to be willing to put time and effort in.
Love it. Yeah. Okay. So, one question I had for you is really maybe an ideological question at its root where, I think you're several years into this work with Ethereum, right? And I think my question would be, what about the vision of Ethereum at this point, maybe as distinct from, some of what drew you to it initially? Like what keeps you still showing up? What keeps you most excited these days about kind of the vision and what it's really about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say one thing that's changed, it doesn't feel as broken anymore. I feel like a lot of the stuff that's like, we worked on in, call it like 2018 to like 2022, like, say with the merge, there was just like a lot of like obviously wrong things with Ethereum. So the first big thing I worked on before the merge was EIP 1559. So this like changed the transaction fee market. And the way the transaction fee market worked on Ethereum before just felt so broken to me. Like if you explained how Ethereum works to somebody who knows nothing about blockchain and just understands like maybe a bit how consumer products or platforms works, like they would intuit that it works basically the way that it does today. And the previous version just like made no sense. But it was much simpler in terms of like architecture and whatnot. And so that's sort of why we had it. But and then similarly, I think when you talk to a lot of the proof of stake researchers and designers, they sort of felt similarly about proof of work, right? Like they just looked at it and they were like, man, this is so broken. Like, and like proof of stake is so obviously better, but there's all this work we need to do to actually make it like production ready. So I'd say in terms of just like, basic functionality, like meeting expectations, like Ethereum is in a much better spot than it was, 4 or 5 years ago. And I think the thing looking forward is just, if you look at like the impact and the scale that it's had, I'd say it's still, kind of minimal, right? Like there's not like millions or hundreds of millions of people using this. I think most of the use cases are still sort of use cases that are kind of within the crypto community, and not that those are necessarily bad, but I think the thing that like I hope we can accomplish is like scaling this to a point where there is a better like interface or like, I don't know, like bridge between what happens on Ethereum and what happens outside of it in the rest of the world. The sort of, the like very short version of this is, I think in the long term, Ethereum can be something like an economic test net for the world, right? Where we have this network which stores value, has like, organizations on it, a bunch of different assets on it as well. And we can run, economic experiments that for whatever reason you sort of can't run in the real world because there's just much higher at stake. And you look at stuff like, quadratic funding being like a great example of that Gitcoin pioneered. This is the type of thing where it's like you can write an economic paper to prove that it's just better than other mechanisms, but no government is going to, switch everything to quadratic funding overnight because people's like food and shelter depends on this stuff. But if we can run it on Ethereum and say like, hey, look, we've allocated, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars using this mechanism, and it's better than whatever other allocation mechanism exists, then you can actually start to get people to like pay attention and, think, oh, maybe this actually works. And I think if we get that, this is sort of how I think Ethereum ends up being like tolerated in the world. I think there's a lot of the like core ethos around blockchains that's just fundamentally at odds with like, how corporations, how nation states view themselves. Just the idea that you like have money that's not tied to any like central issuing entity that people can send freely all over the world is like a pretty contentious thing. And so I think if we want that part of blockchains, where like if we believe that having, economies that are kind of untethered from geographical and nation state boundaries, that's great and we should do it. But we should also think about like, what do we offer back to the world such that they tolerate this and they don't just see it as like purely negative sum for them. And yeah, I think that the best thing we have to offer is being like a test bed for economic and coordination experiments that we can run at like reasonable scale with relatively low risk, and hopefully, prove that, there are ways we can improve this and export those into like nation states and like physical worlds whenever they're ready.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective. I love that. So, this may be a little bit of a difficult question to frame the exact right way, but I'd like to try where, on this podcast, for example, we've heard several founders in the crypto space basically make these offhand remarks about how the future of the space isn't what was maybe originally envisioned, this idea of decentralize all the things and everything will be better, freer. And a part of me has been a little tiny bit disappointed hearing things like that, just because it sounds like the death knell of some of what has kept crypto idealistic and optimistic and principled, if that's even the right word. And so, when I hear plans for Ethereum's future, for example, and the continued good work unfolding for this original, albeit upgraded vision, I'm curious how you would react to the notion that, total decentralization isn't the purpose or trajectory of crypto anymore, that compromises have been and must continue to be made, et cetera, et cetera. I think you touched on this a bit, but I'm curious, kind of putting it like that, how you would respond to that.
Yeah, of course. So look, I think this is a very different conversation if you're talking about applications versus protocols, right? If you're telling me, you want to build some KYC, pseudo DeFi app on Ethereum, it's like, sure, those things can exist. But when you think of the protocol itself, like the protocol should not be able to discriminate between that and say Tornado Cash, right? Like, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. But even without getting political and ideological, I think if you just look at it from a very technical perspective, the thing that's valuable in a blockchain is the fact that the state is all shared together. The fact that there is a chain and we all agree that, right now this is the last block on Ethereum. And as of this last block, I have X balance, you have Y balance, and, there's contracts A, B, and C. If the protocol stops being neutral and say that, I don't know, versions of applications in Europe need to be GDPR compliant, and versions of applications in the US needs to obey US sanctions and whatnot. That's fine if it happens at the smart contract level, but if the blockchain needs to incorporate that, then you're not even going to have a single chain, right? There'll be no way to say, oh, these assets are on Ethereum, because you'd have to literally split the chain to comply with all those things. And if you do this, you've effectively lost the value prop of having this global network in the first place. So I think, that's basically my view around it. It's there's basically little to no value proposition to having blockchains if they're not going to be neutral for people to then build stuff on it. That said, I sympathize with people who run businesses in specific jurisdictions having to comply with that, right? If you live in the US or you live in Europe and you are subject to those laws. And I think the thing hopefully we can do with Ethereum is, make it neutral enough protocol such that it is attractive to people around the world who are in very different, regulatory, legal environments that all use it and coordinate on it. And I think if we can do that, then we've sort of, achieved the vision in a way. And there's a bunch of technical trade-offs and decisions and whatnot that sort of come out of that. But to me, this is really the most important thing. It's can anyone anywhere use this thing, deploy whatever they want? And if we can achieve that at the protocol level, then sure, some applications will be restricted in a bunch of different ways. And that's fine, because somebody else can launch a different version of the application that's not restricted. And you're not locked into that, whatever regulated application was the first one to go live.
Love it. Okay. So Tim, maybe two last questions for you here. First one is a pretty simple question. The thought would be, or the question would be, if you could maybe kind of time machine back to the beginning of sort of your crypto journey and give yourself some advice from this version of yourself, what advice would you most want to impart to that earlier self about how to guide important engineering work in crypto that might have been most helpful to you early on?
Yeah, this is hard. I think, because I think the advice would also change knowing the context today. I think just looking back, 5 years ago or something. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like we ended up in a really good spot, partially because we sacrificed a lot of short-term efficiencies, and that it's we sort of traded off efficiency for resilience, maybe a bit too much in the early days, but I think this definitely got us to a spot where now it feels like we can sort of have both, and that's good. So I'm sure there's a bunch of micro things we could have done better, and but I think the overall strategy, even though it probably wasn't as efficient as it was, I think led to a pretty good outcome. I think if you bring the context to today though, and say I was, starting, or I don't know, if I'm talking to someone who wants to work on protocol engineering and knows nothing about it, to want to start today, I think today it's become big enough of a field that you probably want to find a subfield that and sort of become an expert there rather than trying to do everything. When I started working on Ethereum, it was pretty straightforward. to follow everything that was happening at both the protocol and application level and literally know everything that's happening on Ethereum. I think today, even working just on the protocol, and this is also true working on applications, like it's extremely hard to be at the cutting edge of every aspect of the protocol. So I'd pick one thing and I'd be like, I don't know, say you want to work on MEV, or you want to work on scaling, or you want to work on privacy, or you want to work on like performance optimizations. I would like go down as far as you can down that rabbit hole. And as you do that, you're going to end up intersecting with all the other things, because if you work on privacy, then you're going to end up intersecting with like, okay, who sees the transactions, who builds the block, and that touches on MEV. And if you, or I don't know, say you're working on privacy, a lot of these privacy techniques are like computationally expensive, so you're going to end up looking at what types of optimizations you can do and how our client structures and whatnot. But I think, yeah, taking one aspect that you're really passionate about and diving deep there and accepting that like you'll only see the rest of the protocol mostly through the lens of that thing is probably the most efficient way to go about it, rather than trying to like learn everything about the protocol and then make some contributions to move the whole thing forward. I think that would be extremely hard.
Yep, love it. Okay, so Tim, last question here. What are some of the things you guys are working on right now that people should know about, and what's the best way for people to follow along on the journey?
Yeah. So the main thing we're working on now is what I touched on earlier. So this idea of like providing more data for layer twos. This is called proto dank sharding. We have a website that explains it all. If people want to read into that, it's called EIP4844.com. So that's the main upgrade. Another one of the upgrades that we'll be working on after is called vertical tries. And this is a whole other can of worms, but we also have a website that goes through that. It's called verkle.info, verkle.info. In general, I try to post updates on Twitter at least every 2 weeks. So when I run our calls, I'll summarize everything on Twitter. And then every quarter or so, I try to write a blog post and provide a bit more of a higher level summary. So if you want to follow that, I'm Tim Beiko on Twitter. And I'd say two people who also do a good job of providing context on like everything that happens in the protocol are Christine Kim, who works at Galaxy. I don't know her exact handle, but I'm sure we can find it and put it in the show notes. And then Ben Edgington, who works at Consensus. He's literally writing a book right now on how the entire protocol specification works. So he's someone who's great to like sort of explain in a more accessible way how things actually work, especially with regards to proof of stake and all of the validator infrastructure for Ethereum. Yeah, following all that should be more than enough.
Perfect. Tim, thank you so much for the time. This was really fascinating, and I'm super excited to keep watching all the great work coming out of EF. So have a rest of your week here and take care.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.